When I look at Christoph's CV, I'm particularly deeply impressed by his internationality. And this is not only due to the fact that I was socialized intellectually in the GDR, which doomed its young academics to provinciality and immobility and sorely disregarded skills in foreign languages. No, even in contrast to other academics of his generation in the West, Christoph Conrad's record is truly outstanding and highly remarkable. He studied history, philosophy, and Islamic studies in Berlin, Bonn, Paris, and at Brandeis University. After receiving his PhD from the Free University in Berlin in 1992 for a dissertation on the structural change of old age between 1830 and 1930 in Germany. This was published in 1994. Jürgen Kocker asked him to become his assistant. This is, by the way, a German peculiarity. To be an assistant, that means, at least theoretically, that a postdoc is subordinated to a professor, and in this case to our today's laureate. After 3 years as managing director of the Center for the Comparative History of Europe in Berlin, and this was again in close cooperation with Jürgen Kocker, Christoph Conrad was appointed a full professor by the University of Geneva, where he still teaches contemporary history. He has been invited by numerous distinguished academic institutions, for instance, by the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, the EHESS, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in Wassenaar, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. He is, moreover, since its foundation in 2007, a member of the International Reference Group of the Nordic Center of Excellence, the Nordwell, just like Theda Skotfull, our next speaker. However, we did, of course, not only invite him to today's panel because he worked so long and so closely with Jürgen Kocker, or because of his international profile, but first and foremost because of his excellent publications and his academic expertise in the topic we will discuss today. Christoph Conrad has published extensively on an impressive range of topics, for instance, on the history and theory of historiography, the comparative history of welfare states, civil society and citizenship in Europe, on intergenerational justice in an aging world, or on the history of market research and opinion polling, to name just a few. He is certainly one of the best-known experts regarding the relationship of nation building, between nation building and historical consciousness in the 19th and 20th century. And he was one of the co-directors of the project Representations of the Past, a very famous project funded by the European Research Foundation. And he is also a co-editor of the series Writing the Nation, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan. Christoph Conrad, ladies and gentlemen, does not only attentively follow new developments, he intelligently stimulates the discussion on approaches, methods, and issues, and it can safely be assumed that his academic curiosity and creativity has to some extent been inspired by his PhD supervisor. Christoph Conrad has earned great recognition for his undogmatic and creative approach that links questions and methods of cultural and social history, and I suppose he will demonstrate that today. Today he will talk to us about his research on aging with a paper in some way provocatively entitled Crowding Out or Co-Production, the public-private interplay in the care of the elderly. So please join me in welcoming Christoph Conrad.
Thank you very much, Simone. Am I on? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here to celebrate Jürgen Kocker. I'm very honored to be part of this whole event and would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. When I proposed the provision for old age and the care of the elderly as my theme for today's symposium, I did it not only because this field of research interests me now for more than 30 years, but I also put forward such questions because I want to underline the influence that I think we all can feel from Jürgen Kocker's work. It is his intellectual leadership in at least 3 directions in particular, which forces us to think differently about these issues. And I like to mention very briefly these directions. It is, first of all, of course, his foregrounding of the concept of civil society in public debate, but also in historical research. It is the second direction is the attention which he has devoted in recent years to problems of the aging society in organizing particularly a huge panel of experts for the German Academies of Sciences. And thirdly, it's a direction which is currently still underway. It is his wide-ranging effort to rethink the history of work, both in a life cycle perspective and on a global cross-cultural level. And this is going on now in a research college with our colleague Andreas Eckert in Berlin. What holds those 3 directions together is certainly their intellectual productivity and their capacity to encourage new empirical research. But what is more, these 3 directions of intellectual leadership prepare the ground for a recentering or decentering and reorienting of some of the dominant political and societal narratives. And one of these narratives is the discourse on the welfare state crowding out all other private, informal, or civil society type activities. So it is with this big program in mind that I would like to discuss some of these crucial questions of crowding out or perhaps even crowding in with you. And I do it, of course, in a very cavalier fashion to keep to the time limit, which Simone is controlling here in front of me. My aim is to criticize 2 influential political narratives, and finally to contribute perhaps some thought to a new, more complicated narrative of the welfare society that is needed for our future challenges. So I will very briefly address some of the definitional problems, then give you some historical arguments to answer to the question, and thirdly some present-day social scientific arguments to finally conclude on the theme of changing narratives. Crowding out. A recurrent critique on the welfare state is that it crowds out, that it pushes aside, that it supplants social capital or informal activities, networks, that it also diminishes trust between people and in institutions, and that it relativizes and weakens norms of solidarity and engagement. This is a strong critique, especially for someone who is interested in civil society activities, for example, the civil society tradition in Central Europe that were so crucial to criticize, intellectually, to criticize the authoritarian socialist regimes, or it is a crucial critique and challenge for somebody who wants to encourage more civil society activities in our own societies, particularly to face the challenges of aging societies. So if the welfare state itself is a problem, then we need to rethink not only our social history, but especially our political future. So, to put it more generally, is the growth of the welfare state detrimental to the activities of the welfare society, in which families, informal help, mutual funds, self-organization in general played and plays such a crucial role? In order to test this hypothesis empirically, one should be more precise. Crowding out does not mean substitution between policies or institutions. It could be very logical, and it has been done, of course, in the past, to substitute poor law provisions for older elderly people by social insurance type or citizen wage type programs on the state level. This is not crowding out, this is an intended substitution and, in a way, contributes to increasing welfare. Crowding out is about unintended consequences. Crowding out is about perverse effects. But these effects can have an amazing impact. The underlying model, of course, of crowding out is a zero-sum game. What the state does is somehow offset by what the private citizens and their networks do. So welfare is not increased if the state is spending more money. The discourse comes packaged in two political narratives. One we forgot a little bit was a leftist, anti-statist discourse, which feared a welfare state that would colonize the life world, to cite another Holberg Prize winner. It was a discourse also that criticized welfare state institutions, especially the Bismarckian tradition of authoritarian, statist welfare state provisions, to crowd out, to put aside, and even to repress self-organized, solidaristic, working-class self-help organizations. This discourse, or this narrative we forgot a little bit, which is dominant today, of course, is the neoliberal narrative of the welfare state, and this is the classical argument of crowding out. Every krona or every euro or every dollar spent by the state is offset on the private level by non-spending, non-saving, non-investing, and this is true for money, and this is especially true for other types of activities. It is true for engagement, solidarity, self-help, and care. Let's muster some of the counter-arguments. The historical trends concerning old age, but one could also talk about health, family policy, unemployment, or other areas. Only old age is so massive as an object of policy making in the welfare state that a hypothesis about crowding out should be tested in any way against policies for old age. Three areas where the welfare state, since the mid-19th century, since the last third of the 19th century until today, created something new, but where the state could not, was totally incapable of creating it alone. This is my argument, and it is an argument especially against the zero-sum game. No, the state moved in, the state became bigger, but as a whole, welfare increased and was not offset by welfare losses on the private side. 3 areas, very briefly, because I think I talk here largely to a historical public and I don't have to spell it out. Retirement income, a whole life stage, freed more or less from work, from paid work, financed by transfers from the state to the citizen, from social insurance to social injuries, from pension funds to former workers, from private insurance to insurance holders. This is a huge arrangement of public-private mix of income packaging which has come about in the welfare states of Europe, but also of the United States, of the former colonies of Britain, and now more or less all over the world. It comes with enormous variety in international comparison, but one thing is clear, even in the systems which rely largely on private financing, private in citation marks, so the systems of Switzerland, the system of the US, or the system of Britain and the Netherlands, as contrasted to the social democratic model according to Esping Anderson, or to the corporate conservative model in France or Germany. Even in these countries, the state acted as an organizer, as a guarantor, and as a last resort for all the private efforts in there. The fact that retirement was realized for the large majority of older people, let's say from the 1950s, 60s onwards, is a result of co-production between public, state-based institutions and private or self-organized institutions on the other side. It worked, it increased welfare for everybody, and it is today a fact of life and a fact of the welfare society that cannot be pushed back anymore. Just one little argument from a historian. In the first years, for example, of the Bismarckian systems, the pensions were so low that the family economy, the income mix that families, through the work of their children, through other income, through some of the savings, and through minor paid labor, could muster to complement the state pension, were absolutely crucial to make the success of the first insurance viable for people. There is, in a way, the private networks helped to realize the intentions of the legislator. And Bismarck might be the first theorist of crowding in. I'm sorry, I could not find a citation by Max Weber on crowding in, but so I took Bismarck. He once said, well, the poor pensioner who gets some cash from the state, some cash income from the state, will be very valued by his family. They will suddenly start to really like him because he has every month a cash income, and so his daughter-in-law will be much kinder to him. This is an argument of crowding in. The state does something, and then the private help and the private networks help. Let me point to 2 other areas where, again, for the elderly, the state did something new, but it did it not alone. And this very briefly, it's the huge area of health services and the health provisions for the elderly. There, very briefly, it's when you look at the scientific side of it, the development of geriatrics. If you look at the insurance side of it, the inclusion, the slow inclusion of the elderly, especially the retired or the disabled or the unemployed, into a system of either poor law medicine or at least at last even social insurance, medicine. This is a slow process. It is perhaps not totally successful in every country, but after the Second World War, again, the elderly in the health system moved from the margins to the center of attention. And again, this is the result of a mix of institutions, of a mix of policies, of changed attentions in science, in the private insurance sector, in what the central state, what the communes, and again, other self-help organizations, mutual funds, did to include people who were not working any longer under the coverage of a system designed for working people. And the third aspect, and I come back later to this, is of course long-term care. This is perhaps the most problematic area to say something nice about the state, because except for the Nordic countries and the Netherlands, most European countries who are welfare states are reluctant to really engage fully in the social services and in the financial coverage that would help families and especially spouses and daughters to care for long-term disabled or long-term ill elderly parents. Until today, in Germany, the figure is 2/3 of all help for long-term care, for all care as work is done in families and households. So there we have rather a kind of a minor role of the state, but still we can only hope, and we see it in the model countries that I mentioned, only hope again in a co-production of public coverage, of publicly provided services, of more professionalization, but not to supplant private help, but to help it and to encourage it. Let me give very briefly some arguments from current social scientific research. It's cross-national, it is present day, it's with large samples, and I know that our third speaker will say something about this too. Just to make two arguments about the crowding out hypothesis. What is very interesting that this kind of cross-national comparison, sometimes of 20 nations which are covered under something like the European Value Survey or other big research programs of this kind, that it is in the most developed welfare states, especially in the Nordic welfare states, but also in Holland and in Germany, that associational life, self-help, mutual funds, networks, but also individual trust in institutions, etc., are still flourishing. And so let's say the argument that there where a lot of state welfare is going in, you have less of this kind of privately civil society or informal area is contradicted. It is in the countries where you have a lot of state welfare, you have also a lot of private engagement. And on the other side of the scale are the Mediterranean countries. And one indicator which was already researched 10 years ago would not surprise you today. The Greek has the least trust in their institutions. Well, sometimes public opinion is realistic. But still, and there I come back to the question of long-term care. Of course, the large dependence even of our total welfare produced for the elderly, for the older generation, on the work of, especially of women in private households and in their family, is of course a fragile co-production, is a fragile element of welfare production. And it is a big question how the state on every level, the central state, the regional state, the communes, can in the future encourage and surround and in a way help this informal sector to continue. We know that we are under challenges in the future. We will have more elderly people. We have more elderly people with grave dementia or illnesses, and we have less people in the private households, especially less younger women available for this type of private activities. So there is a field of action, and it is therefore very interesting to see there how today in the kind of social scientific research, people react to this particular field of, let's say, not only visiting elderly parents, having daily or weekly contacts, helping them also materially from time to time, for organizing things for them or helping them with bureaucracy, but also the question of really actual physical bodily care. And I would like just to cite one result of a study which was done by the sociologist at Zurich, at the University of Zurich, where it's a research group on generations, that yes, one can find in several countries, again with the contrast between the Nordic and the Southern European countries, that one can find arguments for even for crowding in, that the availability of social and health services in these countries matter also for the extent of, let's say, familial welfare provision. There is a crowding in of the help children give their parents, but, and now comes the momentum that is serious, but a crowding out of physical care. As soon as there are professional providers and there is a possibility of resorting to ambulance services, and then physical care goes back. And in the countries where this does not exist very well, for example, Italy or Spain, parents' kinship networks are still very engaged in physical care. But one could draw the conclusion that this is a fragile arrangement, and that there is an area where not only thought is needed, but probably also financial and professional engagement in order not to fall into the zero-sum trap that if the state does something, the others are retreating. Let me come just to finish now to my last point, and this is the question of political narratives. And I say narrative in a deliberate way. I think we have to, and people always did, tell stories of the welfare state. Of course, the old story of the 19th and early 20th century, that's to say the Whig story of democratization and prosperity, and so does not convince very much after the crisis of the 20th century and in our own situation. Also the social democratic narrative, and I use a caricature here. I know that I will be corrected later on by my colleagues, but the old social democratic tale, in a way, of politics against markets. That is to say, you need a strong labor movement, you need strong socialist or social democratic parties, and only when these work together with some allies in the society, that social insurance or health services are organized on a universal, national, and inclusive level. And if you don't have that, this goes immediately back. Private, informal resources, self-help were clearly underestimated in this discourse. They were not necessarily unexistent in reality, but they were clearly underestimated in this discourse. And what's more a problem, when you said, okay, but we have something like a crisis, this discourse or this narrative would have only one solution: more of the same. You need more engagement, more political resource mobilization, and more money for such things. So this is perhaps not so convincing anymore. Of course, the neoliberal narrative, which is attacking, which is hegemonic, which you find a lot in public debates, that's to say, as I said, this neoliberal narrative of the state, that to say the growth of the state destroyed everything else, destroyed especially the motives and the energies of civil society that were once in the past there, and destroyed also the wonderful living together of generations in the family. Of course, this narrative is not acceptable to historians because this narrative gets the story wrong. And I gave you some arguments that it got it wrong, especially with the development of welfare states for the elderly, but it got it wrong in a fundamental sense too, because you cannot expect, which is of course the reverse of the neoliberal narratives, that you cut back the state and the private sector would move in. So in a way, the crowding out hypothesis is first of all wrong, but secondly, it cannot be reversed. What would be an alternative? I'm not here for giving you a total narrative, but I think we need a complicated story, but which is can still be communicated to others. It should, and I use the contrast of concepts public-private. You could also use the concepts, the contrasting concepts dear to Hannah Arendt of the political and the social, or as Jürgen Kocher proposed, civil society versus or with the state. I think we have to get used to a narrative which is somehow ambivalent about these things, that doesn't look at these contrasting concepts as contrasts or as dichotomies, but as scales of possibilities. We need to get used to some hybridity. We have to underline interplay, productive interplay. We have to avoid the trap of the zero-sum game. But we should, I think, make clear as historians and as citizens that co-production of welfare is not only needed, but is the realistic way for the future. A little note, and I close with this, we have no reason to romanticize this relationship. It is not harmonic. It is based on tensions, it's based on power, conflicts, and it often didn't work. It was fragile, and especially the role of family and of people inside the family stays a challenge for today's welfare states, both in Greece and in Norway. Thank you very much for your attention.